Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is this issue of income inequality in New Zealand. Now, a lot of you will have seen this in the media recently. What I'm trying to do today is cut through a bit of the heat that this debate sometimes generates and really give you the facts, the background information, the key points that show that this really is an issue that we all as New Zealanders need to be worried about. And the best way to think about this growing income inequality that we see in New Zealand is to look at what's happened to people's incomes since 1984 running through until 2011. And if you start with the incomes of three typical people in New Zealand, someone in the bottom 10%, someone in the middle, and someone in the top 10%, and you look at their annual disposable income adjusted for inflation, what you see is that for the first two people, someone in the bottom 10% and someone in the middle, there really hasn't been much increase in income. People in the bottom 10% are bumping along at around about $10,000, $11,000 a year, and have been for the last 30 or so years. The average person in the middle has seen their disposable income increase from about $25,000 to about $30,000 a year, so it's not a great deal. Whereas a typical person in the top 10% has seen their disposable income more or less double over that period. So you already see, an unequal distribution of the income that's been generated in New Zealand in the last 30 years. If you look finally at the typical person in the top 1%, now here we have to use a different data set, so this is pre-tax income. But if you look at what has happened to that typical person's income, it really has risen quite sharply over that same period. What that also means when you have an unequal distribution of income is you get a very unequal distribution of wealth as well. This is a graph of basically the total net worth of individuals in New Zealand from 0% to 100%. And what you can see is the top 1% of the population has about 15% of all the wealth. The top 10%, the top three bars have about 50%, whereas the lowest half of New Zealand has just about 5% of all the total wealth. And the reason I think that you're hearing so much about income inequality now is that what you've just seen represents the developed world's biggest increase in income inequality from the mid-80s to the mid-2000s. We used to have one of the narrowest income distributions in the developed world. We're now amongst a group of countries that have the most unequal distributions. And you can really see that reflected in some recent opinion polling that came out just a couple of weeks ago, showing that over 70% of people no longer think that New Zealand is an egalitarian country, and that the gaps are widening and that those things are bad for New Zealand. And I think it's important to note that although this is an issue that affects all of us, woven into this story is the fact that Māori and Pacific people are both twice as likely to be in poverty as Pākehā, and the inequalities within their communities have widened significantly in recent years as well. If you think about why this has happened, which is a really key question, particularly when people start to talk about what you might do about income inequality, there are a whole lot of different factors that have created that increase in the gap, in the income gap. Some of it's to do with globalisation, forces that are kind of outside of our control. The fact that in the modern economy, people with education are much more likely to be well remunerated than people without. That's a driver. There are some demographic issues, big rise in the number of single-parent households, for example. So some of the things that drive inequality are, really big picture things that it's difficult to do a great deal about. But I don't agree with the argument that inequality is really something that's totally out of our control. Globalisation is a fact of life for all countries around the world, and yet not all of them have seen a big increase in inequality. In New Zealand, we have one of the world's lowest, or the developed world's lowest degree premium, the earnings advantage for someone with a degree over someone who doesn't have one. So education can't be a big part of the story here. And I think a lot of the things that have driven income inequality in this country are specific political decisions that have been taken. In factors like the very significant decrease in the number of people who are covered by collective agreements, the much lower taxes that we now levy, the reduced benefits since the 1990s, and much greater rates of unemployment, and a real failure to invest in people who've been made unemployed through structural change. So I think those are all the drivers of this issue. When you start to think about why you might be worried about this issue, why is that a problem? I mean, given that there's always a degree of inequality in any free society, it's worth remembering that it's not just people like me who are raising this. All these institutions and people have, in the last year or two, said that inequality is a huge issue that we need to be concerned about, both for social and economic reasons. Now, there's a huge range of those reasons that I could cite now, but I just want to run quickly through four of them. What I think are four of the key things, the key ways in which you could describe income inequality as a corrosive force on the things that we would all like to see in a good functioning society. The first point is the way that inequality is corrosive of the things that hold us together as a society. The more people earn very significantly different amounts, the less they see of each other's lives. And I think that has implications for democracy. I mean, how can people anywhere on the spectrum really make good decisions, make sensible voting choices about issues that affect us all, if they see so little with the people at the other end of the spectrum? Trust declines in an unequal society. The less you see of other people's lives, the less you are inclined to trust them. And trust has declined significantly in New Zealand in recent years. People also become less likely to get involved in the kind of community work that you all do. We know in Auckland, for instance, that as that city has become increasingly segregated in terms of where people live, people have become measurably less likely to take their skills outside of their own community into areas where they would be of great use. And so just in general, you see a loss of that social cohesion, those ties that bind us together and which enable us to come together and actually negotiate the shared challenges that we have in the 21st century. So that's the first corrosion, as I think of it. The second one is you tend to get more health and social problems in more unequal societies. Anyone who's read The Spirit will be familiar with this graph. It shows as countries become increasingly unequal along that axis, their rate of health and social problems increases for a whole number of reasons to do with higher rates of competitive materialism, social stress, shame, stigma, all these kinds of effects. And these effects are felt not just amongst people in the bottom 10% of any society, but right across the spectrum, across a huge swathe of low and middle income earners in particular. Thirdly, I think inequality is very corrosive of opportunity. And this is a really important point, I think, for all of us who believe strongly in a fair go and equal opportunities for everyone. What this graph is measuring, again, is as countries become more unequal across that axis. And on the other axis, it's measuring generational earnings elasticity, which is sort of a fancy way of saying how much of your income as an adult can be predicted from how much your parents earn. And what you see from this graph is that in relatively equal countries, less than 0.2, so less than 20% of your income in adulthood could be predicted from what your parents had earned. But in the most unequal countries, fully half of your income as an adult can be predicted from what your parents earn. And it's not hard to see how that happens in a society with increasingly wide income gaps. You get very different opportunities offered to children growing up at the ends of that spectrum, and then that reinforces through the schooling years and into the workforce. The fourth and final corrosion that I want to mention is around the economy. Now, this is a very complex issue, and there's a lot of debate amongst economists about what exactly is the effect of inequality on economic growth. but there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that it's a negative one. A research paper from the IMF just a few days ago analysed the data and concluded that countries with lower levels of income inequality tend to have higher economic growth rates and longer sustained spells of growth. And they suggested that's because in more equal societies there's more income going to the lower and middle income consumers whose spending is so important to stimulate the economy, because those families are also better able to invest in the education of their children and thus build a long-term productive workforce, and because they tend to have politics that are open to all and which produce economic policies that produce shared economic growth. And wherever you are kind of in that, wherever you think that debate is sitting, I think you can certainly say that given there are economies with better growth rates than ours, which are much more equal, it's very difficult to defend our current levels of income inequality on economic growth. So, having said all of that, I think those kind of key corrosions, as I think of them, are a really strong part of why this is now so much an issue in the public mind. And all the polling at the moment shows that inequality, having not really been an issue in people's minds maybe 2 or 3 years ago, is now one of the key concerns that people have. And that's going to be an ongoing debate, particularly through this election year, but I think on into the years to come. I have a website, inequality.org.nz, which is going to kind of host some of that ongoing conversation. We have the book that we published last year. We just published we're about to publish a short cut-down version of that as a sort of introduction to the debate. And it's all kind of aimed at trying to improve people's awareness of what I think is a huge issue, and one that you may have seen Barack Obama has called the defining issue of our time. Now, I mean, the question of how the rewards of growth are shared is one that's always an issue that societies face. But coming out of an era where those rewards have not been shared entirely equally across a spectrum, I think it's a question that we have to face with particular urgency. And on that note, I'd like to close and to say thank you very much for listening to me. I'm very interested to hear any questions or comments you may have. Thanks very much. Yep, that's a very good point. And you couldn't ever say that any one single factor is the sole determinant of economic growth, right? So inequality is in there amongst a whole lot of other factors. I think you also have to separate out developing countries from developed countries, and I probably could have been a bit clearer in that. A lot of these arguments about developed countries, if you think about, say, the graph on how, say life expectancy or something like that changes as you become wealthier and wealthier as a country. If you're a developing country, there's a very strong argument that becoming wealthier is good for life expectancy, good for life satisfaction, all those things. So income inequality is less of a concern, frankly, in those kinds of societies. But once you reach a certain point, the point that developed countries have got to, becoming wealthier no longer delivers you any reliable increase in any of those things that you care about, life satisfaction, life expectancy. And so China may be entirely a different story, but we're not China. We're already a developed country. So these issues around inequality for us and for the other developed countries are really crucial. And if you go back into that IMF paper, I think you'll find that those are the kinds of issues that they're looking at. I think it could have a significant impact. One of the things it would do is it depends a bit on what your belief is about who is responsible for ensuring that people, have a sort of minimum standard of living and are able to participate and belong. At the moment we take the view that that's not the role of business and that it's the role of government to top up anybody's income who doesn't reach that point. The living wage campaign is essentially about saying, well, no, actually it's business's responsibility to pay that amount rather than government's. wherever you stand on that question, something like the living wage could have a huge impact because, you know, I said at the outset, well, not the outset, one of the things that's driving inequality are things like, I mean, basically diminished bargaining power for people on low incomes. You know, we, in the last 30 years, we've had, I think, the OECD's biggest decline in the number of people covered by a collective agreement. The share of income in New Zealand that goes to labour as opposed to capital is the third lowest in the OECD. Lower, only countries lower than us, I think, are Mexico and Turkey. So a lot of our inequality is driven by the fact that the marketplace delivers a very wide spread of incomes. And yes, absolutely, something that would push up wages at the lower end of that scale could have a big impact. Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, there's one very simple, straightforward answer, and it's the Nordic countries, which have a level of income inequality which is similar to the level that we had in the 1980s, before you started to see that big divergence. I'm always a bit cautious about saying that you can just directly emulate another country because so many things, you know, work in a particular context, and they work because countries are doing a whole lot of different things. But, you know, it is very much those countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, that are, you know, that have managed to remain relatively equal while also having reasonably dynamic, open to the world market kind of economies. If I could pick out just one thing, I also made that point about retraining and reskilling. I mean, whatever else you think about the Nordic countries, they pour a huge amount of effort and money into retraining people who've lost their jobs. They take, you know, active labour market policy seriously. And I think it's one of the things that we as a country have never done well. I mean, we underwent huge structural change, and, you know, and there were undoubtedly a lot of good reasons for that, but the people who were made worst off by that, you know, we never put in the investment to help them cope with the enormous disruption of that, and I think that's one of the big drivers of the inequality we have. Well, I think the most obvious thing that suggests itself is a capital gains tax of some kind. I mean, that's pretty standard across the majority of OECD countries. They also tend to have more progressive tax systems. I mean, you might think that New Zealand has quite a progressive tax system, but actually if you look at it, people in the bottom 10% pay about 30% of their income in income and tax and GST, and that increases only very slowly to about maybe 34% of your income if you're on 150,000 or something like that, because the effect of GST and things like that are so regressive. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, you know, issues in a modern global economy about to what extent you can increase tax rates without seeing some negative consequences. But yeah, I think it has to be part of the mix. Capital gains tax potentially exempting the first few $1,000s of income, as other countries do, yeah, in order to close up some of those income gaps that the marketplaces have recently delivered.